When the world was told the Epstein case was over, something felt unfinished. Official statements suggested closure, headlines moved on, public attention shifted elsewhere, and yet, instead of resolution, a quiet unease remained. The name Jeffrey Epstein did not fade the way other scandals often do. It lingered not because of new revelations, but because the story itself never felt complete. This is where the real mystery begins. Most high-profile cases follow a familiar arc: exposure, investigation, consequences, and eventually closure. Public interest fades once answers are provided and accountability appears visible. But the Epstein case broke this pattern. The more time passed, the more people sensed that what they were given was not understanding but an ending without explanation. David Icke has often pointed out that when a story is declared finished while questions remain unanswered, it doesn't disappear, it sinks into the subconscious of society. People may stop talking about it openly, but the unresolved tension remains. And unresolved stories have a way of resurfacing. What made this case different was not just the severity of the crimes involved, which were already disturbing, but the scope of connections implied and never fully clarified. Names were referenced, documents mentioned, and networks hinted at, yet meaningful transparency never followed in a way the public could independently assess. This created a psychological contradiction. On one hand, people were told there was nothing more to see. On the other, they were asked to accept that a story involving global connections could simply end without broader examination. Human intuition struggles with that kind of disconnect. When a narrative asks people to stop looking without satisfying their sense of logic, curiosity doesn't disappear, it intensifies. This is why the Epstein case continues to surface in conversations, documentaries, leaked files, and online discourse years later. Not because people are obsessed with the man, but because the structure of the story violates a basic expectation of accountability. Another reason the case refused to close is timing. The modern world runs on short attention cycles. News moves fast. Outrage burns briefly. Stories are replaced before they are fully processed. In this environment, declaring a case over often works not because the truth is known, but because attention has been redirected. But some stories resist this process. They resist because they intersect with deeper concerns: power, secrecy, influence, and trust. The Epstein case touched all of these at once. And when trust is shaken at that level, distraction alone is not enough to erase the discomfort. Importantly, this chapter is not about asserting hidden conclusions. It's about recognizing a pattern that many people intuitively felt: that closure was announced before comprehension was achieved. That distinction matters. Closure is administrative. Understanding is psychological. You can close a file. You cannot close a question. And the Epstein case raised questions that extended beyond one individual. Questions about how power operates, how silence is maintained, how certain information surfaces while other information stalls, and how quickly collective focus can be guided elsewhere. When people say the case never ended, what they often mean is this: the narrative stopped, but the implications didn't. This is why references to Epstein continue to appear whenever discussions of influence, secrecy, and accountability arise. He became a symbol not of a single crime, but of a larger discomfort, with how truth and power interact in modern systems. The discomfort isn't about scandal. It's about process, how stories are framed, how investigations unfold, how transparency is defined, and how quickly the public is asked to move on. The case refused to close because it revealed something unsettling, that endings can be declared without understanding, and that silence can be achieved without answers. In the next chapter, we will look closely at the specific questions that were never answered, not as accusations, but as gaps. Gaps that explain why this story continues to echo long after it was officially supposed to end. When a story truly ends, questions fade with it. Curiosity dissolves because understanding has taken its place. But in the Epstein case, curiosity didn't fade, it multiplied. Not because of speculation, but because fundamental questions were left hanging, unaddressed, or quietly sidelined. This is the core reason the case never ended. David Icke often emphasizes that power doesn't need to hide everything, it only needs to control which questions are allowed to be asked. In the Epstein case, attention was directed toward certain details, while others were treated as inappropriate, irrelevant, or already settled. And that imbalance was noticed. One of the most persistent questions was not about guilt, that aspect was already acknowledged, but about scope. The public was told this was a large operation involving extensive connections, yet meaningful clarity about those connections never emerged in a way that could be independently verified or fully examined. Documents were referenced, but not fully released. Investigations were acknowledged, but not transparently concluded. Names were discussed, but rarely contextualized. This created a vacuum, and vacuums don't remain empty, they invite doubt. Another unresolved issue was accountability. In cases involving complex networks, the expectation is not just punishment of one individual, but examination of the systems that enabled the behavior. Yet the narrative narrowed quickly, focusing on Epstein as an isolated figure rather than a node within a broader structure. This narrowing felt deliberate, not as a cover-up in the dramatic sense, but as containment. By keeping the focus tightly centered, the implications remained limited. And when implications are limited, disruption is minimized. The handling of information added to this unease. Files were sealed, timelines shifted, explanations were simplified. Each of these actions can be justified individually, but collectively they created a perception that the public was being asked to accept closure without participation in understanding. And people noticed. Another unanswered question was why transparency appeared uneven. Certain aspects of the case were discussed repeatedly, while others remained largely untouched. This inconsistency didn't create certainty, it created suspicion. Not suspicion of specific individuals, but suspicion of process. How decisions were made, what information was prioritized, why some avenues were pursued and others quietly abandoned. When process lacks clarity, trust erodes. The modern public is more informed than ever, but also more aware of how narratives are shaped. People understand that information can be framed, delayed, or deprioritized without being outright hidden. And this awareness made the gaps in the Epstein case harder to ignore. Another important point is how quickly the emotional intensity was allowed to dissipate. Initial outrage was strong, but it wasn't sustained through transparency or follow-up. Instead, attention shifted elsewhere. New crises emerged. New stories dominated headlines. This pattern felt familiar. Stories that threaten confidence in institutions often fade not because they are resolved, but because focus moves on. The public is not told to forget, it is simply given something else to think about. But forgetting does not equal understanding. The unanswered questions remained, quietly circulating beneath the surface. They reappear whenever related topics arise: power, secrecy, influence, accountability. The Epstein case became shorthand for a broader concern that some stories are concluded administratively, not truthfully. This chapter is not about asserting hidden conclusions. It is about acknowledging a reality many sensed intuitively, that the story stopped asking questions before all reasonable inquiry had been satisfied. And when inquiry is cut short, trust doesn't recover easily. In the next chapter, we will step back and examine how power protects itself without being visible, and why cases like this reveal more about systems than about individuals. One of the greatest misconceptions about power is that it always looks dramatic. People imagine secret meetings, visible force, or obvious suppression. But in reality, power is most effective when it doesn't appear to be acting at all. It doesn't need to silence every question. It only needs to guide attention, slow momentum, and redefine what feels appropriate to investigate. This is where the Epstein case becomes larger than one individual. David Icke has long argued that modern power rarely operates through direct control. Instead, it functions through systems, legal, media, institutional, and cultural structures that quietly shape outcomes while maintaining the appearance of normal process. In cases involving influence and high-level connections, protection does not require a cover-up in the traditional sense. It requires complexity. When processes become too complicated, too technical, or too fragmented, public understanding weakens. Questions don't disappear, they simply lose momentum. This is how power becomes invisible. Legal systems, for example, are designed to handle detail, nuance, and procedure. While this is necessary for justice, it also creates distance between the public and understanding. When explanations become technical, timelines stretch, and documents become inaccessible, curiosity fades, not because answers were found, but because engagement becomes exhausting. Media plays a complementary role. Attention is finite, stories compete, emotional intensity peaks quickly and then declines. A story that cannot sustain new developments quietly slips behind more immediate crises. This is not censorship, it's priority management. And priority management is incredibly effective. Power does not need to instruct media what to ignore. It only needs to ensure that other stories arrive faster, louder, and with clearer emotional hooks. Over time, unresolved stories feel old, outdated, already decided. This is how silence forms without anyone being silenced. Another layer of protection is normalization. When something is framed as already addressed or handled, questioning it begins to feel unnecessary, even inappropriate. People don't want to appear uninformed or conspiratorial. Social pressure encourages acceptance of closure, even when understanding is incomplete. This creates self-regulation. People stop asking not because they were told to, but because it feels socially uncomfortable to continue. power also protects itself through fragmentation. When information is released in pieces, scattered across time and institutions, it becomes difficult to assemble a coherent picture. Individual facts may be acknowledged, but connections remain unclear. Without connection, impact weakens. This is especially effective in cases involving networks rather than isolated actions. Networks are harder to explain, harder to visualize, and harder to hold accountable. They exist across jurisdictions, systems, and roles. When responsibility is distributed, accountability becomes diluted. And diluted accountability feels like no accountability at all. This doesn't require secrecy. It requires structure. The Epstein case revealed how easily focus can be narrowed by centering the narrative on one figure. Broader systemic questions become optional rather than essential. The story becomes about an ending instead of an examination. And endings are comfortable. Examinations are not. This is why certain cases linger psychologically even when they are officially closed. They leave behind the sense that something was bypassed, not hidden, but unexplored, that the surface was addressed while the foundation remained untouched. Power thrives in that space, not because it is malicious in every instance, but because systems are designed to preserve stability. And stability often comes at the cost of deep scrutiny. Understanding this doesn't require belief in hidden plots. It requires recognizing how systems behave when challenged by complexity and discomfort. The Epstein case matters because it exposed this dynamic clearly enough for people to notice. Not everyone noticed, not everyone cared, but enough did for the story to remain unresolved in the public consciousness. It became a reference point, a reminder that closure does not always equal truth, and that power can protect itself simply by continuing to function normally. In the next chapter, we will explore why attention was redirected so quickly and how modern distraction plays a critical role in allowing unresolved stories to fade without ever being resolved. One of the most powerful forces shaping modern reality is not secrecy, censorship, or control. It is attention. What people look at determines what feels real, urgent, and important. And just as importantly, what people stop looking at quietly loses power, even if it was never understood. The Epstein case unfolded during an era where attention moves faster than truth. David Icke often points out that distraction does not require deception. It only requires constant replacement. When one story begins to raise uncomfortable questions, another arrives more immediate, more emotional, more demanding of reaction. The human nervous system can only process so much. Initial exposure to the Epstein story generated shock and outrage. But outrage is not sustainable without continued clarity or development. When follow-up stalled, attention naturally drifted. And once attention drifts, even the most serious questions begin to feel distant. This is not manipulation in the obvious sense. It is structural. News cycles are designed for immediacy, not depth. They reward novelty over resolution. A story that evolves slowly cannot compete with breaking events that demand instant emotional response. So attention moved on. Global crises, political conflicts, economic fears, cultural flashpoints. Each new headline created urgency. And urgency crowds out reflection. People didn't forget the Epstein case. They simply stopped engaging with it actively. This is a critical distinction. Forgetting implies erasure. Distraction un pli postponement. The questions didn't vanish. They were just deferred indefinitely. Another reason attention shifted so quickly is emotional fatigue. Sustained engagement with disturbing material requires energy. When no progress appears, people protect themselves by disengaging. The mind seeks resolution. When resolution isn't offered, it seeks relief instead. And relief often comes through distraction. Social platforms amplify this effect. Algorithms prioritize content that provokes immediate reaction: fear, anger, excitement. Slow, unresolved investigations don't perform well in such environments. They don't provide closure or emotional payoff. So they sink, not because they are unimportant, but because they are unresolved. Over time, unresolved stories become background noise, mentioned occasionally, referenced vaguely, but no longer central to collective attention. This creates the illusion that nothing remains to be understood even when understanding never occurred. Another subtle factor is narrative framing. When a story is repeatedly described as old news or already covered, engagement feels unnecessary. People assume others know more than they do. Silence becomes self-reinforcing. Everyone thinks someone else understands. No one looks deeper. This dynamic benefits systems that rely on stability. Continuous scrutiny destabilizes narratives. Distraction restores equilibrium without confrontation. It allows institutions to continue functioning without addressing discomfort directly. Again, this does not require intent. It is an emergent property of modern information flow. The Epstein case didn't need to be buried. It only needed to be outpaced. Outpaced by faster stories. Outpaced by louder crises. Outpaced by endless streams of information competing for emotional bandwidth. Yet, despite this, the case still resurfaces. Why? Because some stories carry unresolved weight. They attach themselves to broader concerns: trust, transparency, accountability, and when those concerns arise, the story reappears as a reference point. It becomes symbolic, not of a crime, but of a process, not of an individual, but of a system. The Epstein case became shorthand for something many people felt but couldn't articulate: that important questions can be sidelined not by force, but by distraction. In the next chapter, we will examine the repeating pattern behind stories like this and why similar narratives appear again and again throughout history. At a certain point, the Epstein case stops being about Epstein. It becomes something else entirely, a familiar shape that has appeared many times before under different names in different eras across different societies. When you step back far enough, patterns emerge that are difficult to ignore. David Icke often stresses that history does not repeat itself in detail, it repeats in structure. And the structure revealed by the Epstein case is not unique. It follows a recognizable cycle that has played out whenever uncomfortable truths approach powerful systems. First comes exposure. A story breaks through the surface, often unexpectedly. It triggers shock, outrage, and intense public attention. People feel that something hidden has finally been revealed. There is a sense that truth is emerging. Then comes containment. The narrative narrows. Focus shifts toward manageable elements, individual wrongdoing, isolated failure, procedural error. The broader implications are acknowledged briefly, then quietly set aside. Complexity increases, language becomes technical, momentum slows. After that comes partial disclosure. Enough information is released to create the appearance of transparency, but not enough to allow full understanding. Documents exist, but access is limited. Investigations are mentioned, but conclusions remain vague. This creates the impression that the system is functioning while avoiding deeper disruption. Finally comes closure, or at least the declaration of it. The case is said to be finished, accountability is framed as complete, attention moves on. Yet beneath the surface, something unresolved remains. People sense it even if they cannot articulate it clearly. And so the story never truly disappears. This cycle has appeared repeatedly throughout modern history. Scandals involving institutions, intelligence agencies, financial systems, corporations, or political power often follow the same trajectory. Exposure is permitted up to a point, but not beyond the threshold that would force structural reckoning. The Epstein case fits this pattern precisely. What makes it especially significant is how clearly the pattern was visible. The contrast between the scale of implications and the narrowness of resolution was difficult to reconcile. This dissonance is what lodged the story in public memory. The mind struggles with unresolved patterns. When a story ends too neatly compared to its complexity, it creates cognitive friction. People may not consciously analyze it, but the discomfort lingers. It resurfaces whenever similar themes appear. Secrecy, influence, immunity, silence. That is why Epstein's name continues to appear in broader conversations about power. He has become symbolic, not central, a reference point rather than the focus. This is how unresolved stories function in collective consciousness. They become markers, reminders that certain questions remain unanswered, even if the narrative has moved on. Importantly, recognizing a pattern does not require believing in a single hidden explanation. It requires noticing repetition, similar methods, similar outcomes, similar silences. Patterns don't accuse. They reveal behavior. And behavior, repeated over time, tells its own story. Another reason patterns persist is that they benefit from human psychology. Most people want resolution. They want to believe that systems ultimately work, that justice eventually arrives, that authority is accountable. When those beliefs are challenged, the discomfort can be overwhelming. So partial closure becomes acceptable. People accept endings not because they are satisfying, but because uncertainty is exhausting. Over time, the desire for stability outweighs the desire for truth. But the unresolved tension doesn't vanish, it accumulates. It appears as skepticism, as distrust, as a growing sense that official narratives don't tell the full story. The Epstein case didn't create this distrust. It revealed it. It exposed a fault line that already existed between what people are told and what they intuitively feel. And once a fault line is exposed, it doesn't close easily. In the final chapter, we will examine why this story still matters now and what it reveals about our relationship with truth, power, and attention in the modern world. Long after headlines fade, some stories continue to shape how people see the world. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, beneath the surface, influencing trust, perception, and intuition. The Epstein case is one of those stories not because of what was said, but because of what remained unresolved. The reason it still matters is simple. It exposed a fracture between narrative and understanding. David Icke has often emphasized that control in the modern world does not rely on force, but on perception. What people believe has ended. They stop questioning what they believe is explained. They stop investigating, and what they believe is settled, they emotionally release, even if clarity was never achieved. The Epstein case disrupted that mechanism. It ended officially, but not psychologically. And when psychological closure fails, something important is revealed, that trust cannot be commanded, only earned. Once doubt takes root, it doesn't disappear with time, it evolves. This is why the case still surfaces during conversations about transparency, accountability, and power. Not because people are fixated on the past, but because the unresolved nature of the story mirrors a broader experience many feel in modern life, that decisions are made, narratives are presented, and closures are announced without genuine public understanding. The story became symbolic of how information flows, symbolic of how attention is managed, symbolic of how silence can exist without censorship. This matters because societies function on shared belief in process. People don't need to know everything, but they need to trust that systems are oriented toward truth rather than convenience. When that trust weakens, it doesn't lead immediately to rebellion or chaos. It leads to something quieter and more dangerous: disengagement. People stop believing narratives. They stop investing emotionally. They stop trusting explanations. And when that happens, the gap between authority and the public widens. The Epstein case did not create this gap, but it illuminated it. It showed how a story can be closed procedurally while remaining open emotionally, how information can exist without resolution, and how attention can be redirected without understanding. Understanding this is not about blame, it's about awareness. When people recognize how narratives move, how questions fade, not because they are answered, but because they are overshadowed, they begin to see similar dynamics elsewhere, in politics, in media, in institutions, in their own lives. That awareness changes perception. It doesn't make people cynical, it makes them discerning. The lasting impact of the Epstein case is not fear or outrage, it is alertness. A quiet recognition that truth requires more than announcements, that closure without clarity is not closure at all. And that attention is one of the most valuable resources any system can shape. This is why the story never truly ended. It didn't end because it touched something fundamental, the relationship between power and transparency, between narrative and trust, between what is said and what is understood. And once those questions are awakened, they don't go back to sleep easily. The case continues to matter because it reminds people to notice not just what they are told, but how they are told and what happens immediately after. Not every story demands an answer, but every system demands scrutiny. And stories like this ensure that scrutiny doesn't disappear entirely. Subscribe to David Icke to watch more videos and continue exploring the deeper truths behind modern power and perception.